What happens when royal privilege collides headfirst with journalistic integrity on live television? In just 37 seconds, a single dismissive comment would transform a routine interview into the most explosive media meltdown in recent memory, leaving one of the most recognizable faces in the world scrambling to salvage her reputation as cameras rolled and millions watched in stunned silence. Anderson Cooper adjusted his tie one final time as the production assistant held up 3 fingers. 2 fingers. 1 finger. The red recording light flickered on, bathing the CNN studio in its familiar warm glow. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored blazer, her posture rigid with the kind of calculated composure that came from years of public scrutiny. Good evening, I'm Anderson Cooper, and tonight we have a very special guest joining us on Anderson Cooper 360. The Duchess of Sussex is here to discuss her latest humanitarian initiatives and her ongoing work with various charitable organizations. Anderson's voice carried its trademark measured cadence, professional yet warm. Your Royal Highness, thank you for being here tonight. Meghan's smile was perfectly practiced, the kind she had perfected during her time navigating both Hollywood and Buckingham Palace. Thank you for having me, Anderson, though I should mention, I prefer to be addressed simply as Meghan now. The royal titles feel so formal, don't you think? Of course, my apologies. Let's start with your recent trip to Nigeria, where you met with young women entrepreneurs. Can you tell us about that experience? It was absolutely transformative, Meghan began, her hands gesturing elegantly as she spoke. These women, these incredible souls, they reminded me why I do this work. When I looked into their eyes, I saw myself. I saw every woman who has ever been told she couldn't achieve her dreams simply because of where she was born or what she looked like. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. That's powerful. Now, your critics have suggested that some of your international trips lack proper coordination with local governments and established aid organizations. How do you respond to those concerns? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Meghan's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression that Anderson's trained eye caught immediately. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the arm of her chair. Anderson, I think what's important to understand is that my work transcends traditional bureaucratic channels. When you're trying to create real change, you can't always wait for permission from every single government official or aid worker who might feel threatened by fresh approaches to old problems. But surely you understand the importance of working within established frameworks, especially when dealing with sensitive international relations? Meghan's laugh carried a sharp edge. Established frameworks? You mean the same frameworks that have failed these communities for decades? The same systems that prioritize paperwork over people? Her voice began to rise slightly. I didn't leave my acting career and marry into the British royal family to play by rules that don't work. Anderson leaned forward slightly, his journalistic instinct sharpening. I understand your passion, but coordination with local authorities isn't just about bureaucracy. It's about respect for sovereignty and ensuring that aid efforts don't inadvertently cause harm or duplicate existing programs. Respect for sovereignty? Meghan's eyebrows arched dramatically. Anderson, with all due respect, that sounds like something a privileged American man would say from the comfort of his air-conditioned studio. Have you ever held a malnourished child in your arms? Have you ever looked into the eyes of a woman who has been systematically oppressed by the very governmental systems you're defending? The studio fell silent, except for the quiet hum of cameras and lighting equipment. Anderson's expression remained professionally neutral, but those familiar with his work could see the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was processing not just the content of her words, but their tone. I have actually, Anderson replied quietly. I've reported from war zones, refugee camps, and disaster areas for over 20 years. I've held dying children in my arms in Somalia. I've interviewed survivors of genocide in Rwanda, and I've witnessed firsthand the consequences of well-intentioned but poorly coordinated humanitarian efforts. Meghan's cheeks flushed slightly, but she pressed forward. Then you should understand better than anyone that sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Sometimes you have to ruffle some feathers to create real change. I refuse to apologize for being effective. Being effective and being collaborative aren't mutually exclusive, Anderson countered gently. Many of the most successful humanitarian leaders I've interviewed over the years have emphasized the importance of listening to local voices and working within existing community structures. Local voices? Meghan's tone grew increasingly defensive. Anderson, I think you're missing the point. These communities need someone with my platform, someone with my reach and influence, to amplify their voices on a global stage. They need someone who understands what it's like to be marginalized, someone who has faced similar struggles. Anderson paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Can you help me understand how your experiences growing up in Los Angeles and working in Hollywood compare to the experiences of women living in poverty in Nigeria? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Meghan's carefully constructed composure began to crack around the edges. Her breathing became slightly more shallow, and her hands moved restlessly in her lap. That's an incredibly insensitive question, Anderson. I'm biracial. I've faced racism and discrimination throughout my entire life. I know what it feels like to be othered, to be told you don't belong. Just because I achieved success doesn't mean I've forgotten where I came from or what I've been through. I didn't mean to minimize your experiences, Anderson said carefully. But there's a significant difference between facing discrimination in one of the world's wealthiest countries while having access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, and facing poverty and oppression in developing nations without those same resources. Meghan's eyes flashed dangerously. Are you seriously going to sit there and mansplain my own experiences to me? Are you going to tell me that my struggles aren't valid because I happen to be born in America instead of Africa? That's not what I said at all, Anderson replied, his voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. I'm simply suggesting that effective humanitarian work requires acknowledging different types of privilege and understanding how they impact our ability to relate to and serve different communities. Privilege? Meghan's voice cracked like a whip. You want to talk about privilege, Anderson? Let's talk about your privilege. You're a Vanderbilt heir sitting in a multi-million-dollar television studio questioning a woman of color about her humanitarian work. The irony is almost too much to bear. Anderson's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his posture. My family background doesn't change the validity of the questions I'm asking as a journalist. These are questions that humanitarian experts and local community leaders have raised publicly. Humanitarian experts, Meghan repeated mockingly. You mean other privileged Americans sitting in their ivory towers making judgments about work they've never done themselves? I'm out there in the field, Anderson. I'm doing the work, not just talking about it. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as Anderson processed her words. Behind the cameras, production assistants exchanged worried glances. This was no longer a standard celebrity interview about charitable work. This had become something else entirely. I think we should focus on the substance of the concerns rather than attacking each other's backgrounds, Anderson said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him one of television's most respected journalists. Several aid organizations in Nigeria issued statements after your visit, expressing concern that your security detail disrupted ongoing medical clinics and that your photo opportunities diverted resources from scheduled community programs. Meghan's face flushed a deeper shade of red. Photo opportunities? Is that what you think this is about? You think I flew halfway around the world for photo opportunities? I'm simply reporting what local organizations stated publicly. They said your advance team required them to shut down a vaccination clinic for 3 hours to accommodate your visit, which meant dozens of children didn't receive their scheduled immunizations that day. That's ridiculous, Meghan snapped, her composure completely abandoned now. My team would never do anything to harm children. These are probably the same organizations that are jealous of the attention my visit brought to issues they've been failing to address for years. Anderson pulled out a tablet and glanced at it briefly. I have a statement here from Dr. Amara Okafor, who runs the clinic in question. She says, and I quote, "While we appreciate international attention to our work, we hope future visits can be coordinated in ways that don't disrupt essential medical services for our most vulnerable patients." Dr. Okafor? Meghan laughed bitterly. She's probably been paid off by the same people who don't want to see real change happening. You have no idea how corrupt these local systems can be, Anderson. You can't trust everything you read in these so-called official statements. The silence that followed was deafening. Anderson stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to something approaching disbelief. Are you suggesting that a Nigerian doctor who has spent her career providing healthcare to underserved communities is lying about the impact of your visit on her patients? I'm suggesting that there are powerful interests who benefit from keeping these communities dependent on ineffective aid systems. When someone like me comes in and shows what's really possible, it threatens their little kingdoms. Anderson set down his tablet and leaned back in his chair. Meghan, do you hear what you're saying right now? You're dismissing the concerns of local healthcare workers and suggesting they're corrupt. simply because they question the logistics of your visit. I'm being realistic about how these systems work, Meghan shot back. You're being naive if you think everyone involved in international aid has pure motives. Some people make very good livings off of maintaining the status quo. Including yourself? Anderson asked quietly. The question landed like a physical blow. Meghan's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was barely controlled fury. Excuse me? What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly. You've built a significant media brand around your humanitarian work. You've signed lucrative deals with Netflix and Spotify, partly based on your public service profile. Isn't it possible that your visit to Nigeria, however well-intentioned, also served your commercial interests? Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward. I cannot believe you just asked me that question. I cannot believe you would reduce my genuine commitment to helping people to some kind of cynical business calculation. Please sit down, Anderson said calmly. We're in the middle of an interview. No, Anderson, I will not sit down. I will not sit here and be insulted by someone who clearly has no understanding of the sacrifices I've made to do this work. Anderson remained seated, his voice steady. What sacrifices are you referring to? What sacrifices? Meghan's voice cracked with emotion. I gave up my entire career. I moved to a foreign country. I subjected myself to years of racist abuse from the British media. I walked away from financial security to pursue this calling. You walked away from financial security to sign deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars with major media companies? Anderson pointed out, matter-of-factly. Those deals allow me to fund my humanitarian work, Meghan protested, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Do they? Because according to your foundation's most recent tax filings, which are public record, less than 5% of your foundation's expenses went directly to charitable programs. The vast majority went to administrative costs, travel, and media production. Meghan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's completely taken out of context. Building sustainable change requires infrastructure. It requires investment in systems and processes. It requires flying to Nigeria with a security detail that costs more per day than most of these communities see in a year. Security is necessary, Meghan said weakly. I have threats against my life. I have children to think about. I understand the need for security, but do you understand how it looks to communities struggling with basic needs when someone arrives with an entourage that costs more than their annual healthcare budget? Meghan sank back into her chair, but her posture remained defensive. You're twisting everything. You're making it sound like I'm some kind of fraud when all I'm trying to do is help people. I'm not twisting anything. I'm asking questions that any responsible journalist would ask about any public figure who positions themselves as a humanitarian leader while building a commercial empire around that image. A commercial empire? Meghan's voice rose again. I'm trying to use my platform to create positive change in the world. If that bothers you, if successful women of color using their influence threatens you, then maybe you should examine your own biases. Anderson's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. This has nothing to do with your race or gender, and everything to do with accountability. When you accept praise and financial benefit for humanitarian work, you also accept responsibility for legitimate criticism of that work. Legitimate criticism? Meghan stood again, this time pacing beside her chair. Is it legitimate criticism when people question my motives simply because I don't fit their narrow definition of what a humanitarian should look like? It's legitimate criticism when your own actions contradict your stated values. Anderson replied evenly. When you claim to center local voices while dismissing local concerns. When you talk about fighting systemic oppression while operating in ways that reinforce hierarchies of power and privilege. Meghan stopped pacing and fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. I think this interview is over. We still have 12 minutes left in our scheduled time, Anderson said, glancing at the clock on the wall behind the cameras. I don't care what our schedule says. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked by someone who clearly came into this interview with a predetermined agenda to tear me down. Anderson remained perfectly still in his chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Meghan, I didn't come into this interview with any agenda other than asking the questions that responsible journalism requires. If those questions feel like an attack, perhaps that says more about the answers than it does about the questions themselves. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me, Meghan snapped, her voice rising to a level that made the sound engineers behind the glass wince. I've dealt with enough condescending men in my lifetime to recognize exactly what you're doing right now. What am I doing? You're trying to diminish me. You're trying to make me look like some kind of opportunistic fraud instead of acknowledging that I'm a woman who has dedicated her life to service." Anderson's voice remained maddeningly calm. "I'm trying to understand how someone who claims to be dedicated to service responds to legitimate questions about that service by attacking the questioner rather than addressing the substance of the concerns." Meghan's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or adrenaline or both. "The substance? The substance is that I've done more real good in the world than most people ever will. The substance is that while you sit in your comfortable studio asking gotcha questions, I'm out there getting my hands dirty trying to solve real problems. By disrupting vaccination clinics, that was an isolated incident that's been completely blown out of proportion by people who want to see me fail." Meghan shot back. "One scheduling conflict doesn't negate years of meaningful work. What about the concerns raised by organizations in Rwanda, Kenya, and Bangladesh? Are those also isolated incidents blown out of proportion?" Meghan's face went pale. "What concerns?" Anderson consulted his tablet again. Similar issues with coordination, resource allocation, and what several local leaders described as a pattern of extractive engagement, taking photo opportunities and media content from communities without leaving behind sustainable programs or meaningful partnerships. "That's absolutely false," Meghan said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My work has created lasting impact in all of those communities. Can you give me specific examples of that lasting impact?" The question hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Meghan opened her mouth several times as if to speak, then closed it again. Finally, she managed, "The impact isn't always quantifiable in neat little statistics, Anderson. Sometimes change happens in ways that can't be measured by your narrow journalistic standards." "Help me understand what you mean by that." "I mean that when a young girl in Nigeria sees someone who looks like her achieving on a global stage, that plants a seed. That gives her permission to dream bigger. That's the kind of change that matters, even if it doesn't show up in your precious data sheets." Anderson nodded slowly. "That's a beautiful sentiment. But don't you think that same young girl deserves to have her vaccination clinic stay open? Don't you think she deserves humanitarian visitors who coordinate with her community's actual needs, rather than imposing their own vision of what help should look like?" "You're being deliberately obtuse," Meghan said through gritted teeth. "You're refusing to acknowledge the bigger picture because you're obsessed with these minor logistical details." "Minor logistical details like children not receiving medical care? One scheduling conflict?" Meghan repeated desperately. "One single scheduling conflict that has been weaponized against me by people who can't stand to see a successful woman of color operating on the global stage." Anderson leaned forward slightly. "Meghan, I've interviewed dozens of humanitarian leaders over the years, men and women of every race and background. The ones who are truly effective don't dismiss criticism as racism or sexism. They listen to it, they learn from it, and they use it to improve their work." "Don't lecture me about racism and sexism," Meghan exploded. "You have no idea what it's like to navigate these spaces as someone who looks like me." "You're right, I don't. But I do know what it looks like when someone uses their identity as a shield against legitimate accountability." The words hit like a slap. Meghan's eyes filled with tears, whether of rage or humiliation or both. "How dare you? How dare you sit there and accuse me of weaponizing my identity when you have no idea what I've endured?" "I'm not questioning what you've endured. I'm questioning how you respond to criticism of your professional work." "This interview is over," Meghan declared, reaching for the small microphone clipped to her blazer. "I'm done being ambushed by someone who clearly brought me here under false pretenses." Anderson's voice remained steady as she fumbled with the microphone. "What false pretenses? I told your team we'd be discussing your humanitarian work and recent international visits. That's exactly what we've been discussing. You told them this would be a platform to highlight my charitable initiatives, not an interrogation designed to make me look bad. I told them I'd be asking substantive questions about your charitable work. If those questions make you look bad, that's not because of the questions." Meghan finally managed to unclip her microphone and slammed it down on the small table between them. The sound echoed through the studio with a sharp crack that made everyone present flinch. "I'm leaving," she announced, grabbing her purse from beneath her chair. "And I'll be making sure everyone knows exactly what kind of setup this was." Anderson remained seated as she stormed toward the studio exit. "Meghan, we're still recording." She spun around, her eyes blazing. "I don't care if you're recording. Let people see who you really are, Anderson. Let them see how you treat guests who don't fit your narrow worldview." "I treat all guests the same way. I ask questions that serve the public interest." "The public interest?" Meghan laughed harshly. The public interest is served by tearing down women who are trying to make a difference. The public interest is served by amplifying every petty criticism of someone who has dedicated their life to service. The public interest is served by holding powerful people accountable for their actions, regardless of their gender or race or good intentions. Meghan stood frozen in the studio doorway for a moment, as if searching for some final devastating comeback. When none came, she simply shook her head and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. Anderson sat alone at the interview desk, the empty chair across from him seeming to echo with the absence of his departed guest. He looked directly into the camera with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "We'll be right back after this break," he said quietly, and the red recording light finally went dark. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were the quiet hum of equipment powering down and the distant echo of a door slamming somewhere down the hallway. The most explosive 37 seconds in recent television history had stretched into nearly 30 minutes of television that no one in that studio would ever forget. Anderson straightened his tie one more time and prepared for what he knew would be a very long night of damage control, media analysis, and probably more than a few uncomfortable phone calls. But as he sat there in the quiet aftermath, his expression remained exactly what it had been throughout the entire ordeal. The calm, measured look of a journalist who had simply done his job.